The experiment in teleportation had been years in the making. The scientists had poured their hearts and souls into the project, working day and night to make sure that everything went smoothly. They had tested and retested the equipment, and they were confident that it was ready for its first human trial. The subject, a young man named Jack, was chosen for the experiment. He was brave and eager to be a part of something so groundbreaking. He stepped into the teleportation chamber and the scientists began the countdown. "Initiating teleportation sequence in 3, 2, 1, said one of the scientists. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light and a loud, deafening explosion. When the smoke cleared, Jack was nowhere to be found. The scientists frantically searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Until finally, they discovered a video feed from the other side of the teleportation portal. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jack had been transported to a nightmarish parallel universe. The world on the other side was a twisted, dark version of their own. The sky was blood red and the air was thick with the stench of death. The ground was barren and lifeless, and there was no sign of civilization anywhere. Jack stumbled through the desolate wasteland, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was or how he was going to get back home. But he knew one thing for certain: he was not alone. He heard strange, guttural noises coming from all around him. He turned to see a group of grotesque creatures, their eyes glowing with a sinister red light. They bared their razor-sharp teeth and started to move in on him. Jack tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. He was trapped, alone in a hostile world with no way to defend himself. The creatures closed in, their hot breath on his face. Suddenly, he heard a voice in his ear. "Jack, can you hear me?" It was one of the scientists from the other side. "Get me out of here," Jack shouted. "We're working on it, just hold on a little longer," the scientist replied. Jack closed his eyes and prayed that he would make it back home alive. He could feel the creatures tearing at his flesh, their claws digging deep into his skin. But then, he felt a rush of cool air and he knew that he was back in the teleportation chamber. He collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. The scientists rushed to his side, their faces filled with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. Jack looked up at them, his eyes wide with fear. "Never again," he said. "Never again." The scientists helped Jack to his feet and led him to a nearby medical bay. They examined him thoroughly to make sure that he hadn't suffered any serious injuries during his journey. Jack lay on the medical bed, still trembling from the experience. "What the hell happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. One of the scientists sat down beside him. "We're not entirely sure," she said. "Something went wrong with the equipment. We think it may have been a glitch in the system." "A glitch?" Jack scoffed. "You almost got me killed." "We know, and we're deeply sorry," the scientist said. "But we'll do everything in our power to make sure that this never happens again." Jack nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of terror that still lingered within him. "What about the other universe?" he asked. "What did you see?" The scientist hesitated. It was a nightmare," she said. "The world on the other side was twisted and dark. We don't even know if it was a parallel universe or some kind of hellish dimension." Jack shuddered. He didn't want to think about what could have happened to him if he had been stuck there for much longer. "We're going to shut down the experiment for now," the scientist continued. "We need to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it before we try again." Jack nodded, relieved. He knew that he never wanted to go through something like that again. As he was released from the medical bay and made his way out of the laboratory, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He turned back to look at the teleportation chamber, feeling a chill run down his spine. He knew that the experiment had gone horribly wrong, but he couldn't help wondering what else lay beyond the portal. What other horrors were waiting to be discovered in the vast, unexplored multiverse? Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the failed teleportation experiment began to fade from Jack's mind. He went back to his normal routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One day, he was walking home from work when he heard a strange humming sound coming from a nearby alleyway. Curiosity getting the better of him, he decided to investigate. As he approached the alley, he saw a flickering light coming from behind a dumpster. He cautiously peeked around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. To his shock, he saw the teleportation chamber. It had been hidden away in the alley, seemingly abandoned. But the lights were on, and the equipment was humming with life. Jack felt a mix of fear and curiosity. He knew that the experiment had been shut down, but he couldn't resist the temptation of stepping back into the portal. Without hesitation, He stepped into the chamber and the scientists on the other side began the countdown. Initiating teleportation sequence in 3, 2, 1. This time, there was no explosion. The world around him began to blur and twist, and Jack felt himself being pulled through the portal once again. When he opened his eyes, he was greeted by a sight that filled him with dread. He was back in the Nightmarish parallel universe, but this time, the creatures were waiting for him. They surrounded him, their eyes glowing with a sinister red light. Jack tried to run, but they were too fast. They tore at his flesh, their razor-sharp teeth sinking deep into his skin. He screamed for help, but there was no one around to save him. He was alone in a world of darkness and terror. Suddenly, he heard a voice in his ear. "Jack, can you hear me?" It was one of the scientists from the other side. "Get me out of here," Jack shouted. "We're trying, but the system is malfunctioning." The scientist replied. Jack's heart sank. He was trapped, and there was no way out. He closed his eyes and prayed for a miracle. But then, he heard a loud explosion. The portal had collapsed, and he was plunged into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in the alleyway where he had first discovered the portal. He stumbled out of the chamber, gasping for air. The scientists rushed to his side, their faces filled with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. Jack looked up at them, his eyes wide with fear. "Never again," he said. "Never again." The scientists helped Jack to his feet, and led him back to the laboratory. They examined him thoroughly to make sure that he hadn't suffered any serious injuries during his journey. Jack was pale and trembling, unable to speak. He sat down in a chair, staring blankly ahead. "We're so sorry, Jack," one of the scientists said. "We never meant for this to happen. We thought we had fixed the problem." Jack shook his head. "It's not your fault," he said. "I shouldn't have gone back in. I was stupid." The scientists exchanged worried glances. They knew that Jack was traumatized, and they weren't sure how to help him. "We're going to shut down the experiment for good," one of them said. "It's too dangerous." Jack nodded, his eyes still fixed on the floor. He knew that he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. As he left the laboratory, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned around, but there was no one there. He hurried back to his apartment, feeling more and more anxious with each passing moment. He locked the door behind him, and collapsed onto his bed. But he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the twisted creatures from the other universe. He heard their snarls and their screams, and he knew that they were still out there. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were coming for him. Days turned into weeks, and Jack became more and more paranoid. He wouldn't leave his apartment, and he refused to answer the phone or the door. One night, he heard a scratching sound coming from his window. He tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and more persistent. He cautiously approached the window, and peered outside. To his horror, he saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The creatures had followed him back to this world, and they were coming for him. He knew that he had to do something. He gathered all of the materials he could find, and began to construct a makeshift weapon. He worked all through the night, fueled by fear and adrenaline. When the sun began to rise, he stepped out of his apartment, ready to face whatever was waiting for him. To his surprise, there was no one there. The creatures had disappeared, and Jack was left alone with his fears. He knew that he would never be the same again. The experiment in teleportation had changed him, and he could never go back to the way things were before. As he walked back to his apartment, he heard a voice in his ear. "Jack, can you hear me?" It was one of the scientists from the laboratory. "We've done it," she said. "We've fixed the problem. The experiment in teleportation is safe again." Jack nodded, his eyes filled with tears. He knew that he would never step foot in that chamber again. He had been to hell and back, and he never wanted to go there again. The scientist on the other end of the line could hear the emotion in Jack's voice. "Are you okay, Jack? Do you need help?" Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'll be okay," he said. "I just need some time to process everything." The scientist nodded. "Take all the time you need. We're just glad that you're safe." Jack hung up the phone and collapsed onto his bed, still trembling with fear. He knew that he had been lucky to escape with his life. The experiment in teleportation had gone horribly wrong, and he had been transported to a nightmarish parallel universe. But even though he was back in his own world, he knew that he could never escape the memories of what had happened to him. He had seen things that no human being was ever meant to see. He had faced horrors that he could barely comprehend. And he knew that he would never be the same again. As Jack lay on his bed, lost in his thoughts, he heard a knock at the door. His heart raced as he cautiously approached the door, not sure what he would find on the other side. He opened the door, and to his relief, it was just his neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. "Jack, are you okay?" she asked, her concerned eyes scanning his face. Jack nodded. "I'm okay, Mrs. Johnson. Just a little shaken up." Mrs. Johnson gave him a sympathetic smile. "I heard about what happened to you. It must have been terrifying." Jack nodded, still unable to shake the memories of the other universe from his mind. "I know it's not much, but I made you some soup," Mrs. Johnson said, holding out a pot of steaming liquid. Jack gratefully accepted the soup, touched by his neighbor's kindness. As he sat down to eat, he felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. He knew that he still had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. He knew that he would never forget what had happened to him, but he also knew that he couldn't let it define him. He had to find a way to move on, to live his life, and to face whatever came his way. And as he sat there, eating Mrs. Johnson's soup, he knew that he was one step closer to doing just that. As Jack finished his soup, he thanked Mrs. Johnson once again and bid her good night. He went back to his room and sat on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. He felt drained and exhausted, both mentally and physically. Suddenly, his phone rang. He checked the caller ID and saw that it was the scientist from the lab. "Jack, we need to talk," the scientist said, his voice urgent. "What is it?" Jack asked, bracing himself for bad news. "We've been monitoring the equipment from the experiment, and we've detected some unusual readings. We think that something may have followed you back." Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "What do you mean, something followed me back?" "We're not sure yet, but it appears to be a life form of some kind. We need you to come back to the lab so we can run some tests and figure out what's going on." Jack hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'll be there as soon as I can." As he hung up the phone, he knew that he was in for another ordeal. But he also knew that he had no choice but to face it head on. He got up from his bed, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for whatever lay ahead. Jack quickly got dressed and headed out the door, making his way to the lab. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned around several times, but there was no one there. When he finally arrived at the lab, he was greeted by a group of scientists, all huddled around a computer screen. "Jack, we've detected some strange readings," one of the scientists said, gesturing towards the screen. "It appears that something is inside the lab with us." Jack's heart sank. "What do you mean, something is inside the lab?" "We're not sure yet," the scientist said, "but it appears to be some kind of creature. It's moving fast, and it's definitely not from our world." As the scientists hurriedly set up equipment to try to capture the creature, Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. He had a feeling that he was about to face something even more terrifying than what he had encountered in the other universe. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and Jack and the scientists turned around to see the creature standing in front of them. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was humanoid, but with elongated limbs and claws that glinted in the lab's fluorescent lights. Its eyes were glowing, and its skin was covered in a slick, oily substance. The scientists scrambled to contain the creature, but it was too fast. It moved with lightning speed, slashing at anything that came near it. As Jack watched in horror, the creature lunged at him, its claws extended. He closed his eyes, expecting the worst, but when he opened them again, he saw that the creature was gone. The scientists were all staring at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and awe. "What just happened?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "We don't know," one of the scientists said, "but it appears that you have some kind of connection to the other universe. You were able to send the creature back." Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had no idea how he had done it, but somehow, he had managed to send the creature back to the other universe. As he left the lab and headed back home, he knew that his life would never be the same. He had faced unimaginable horrors, but he had also discovered a strength within himself that he never knew existed. And as he looked up at the stars above him, he knew that there were still countless mysteries waiting to be discovered, both in his world and beyond. As Jack walked towards his house, he took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to calm his nerves. He knew that he had just narrowly escaped a horrific fate, But he was also grateful for the experience, as it had given him a newfound appreciation for the fragility of life and the vastness of the universe. As he unlocked the door to his house and stepped inside, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He was back in his own world, safe and sound. But as he made his way towards his bedroom, he noticed something strange. The room looked different somehow, as if it had been rearranged. He walked closer and saw that there was a note on his bed. He picked it up and read it, his heart pounding in his chest. The note read, "We will always be watching you. You cannot escape us." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that his adventure was far from over, and that there were still unknown horrors waiting for him in the darkness. But he also knew that he had the courage and strength to face them head-on, no matter what they might be. As he sat down on his bed and closed his eyes, he whispered a prayer for protection and strength. And then, with a deep breath, he opened his eyes and prepared himself for whatever lay ahead.